Good evening, welcome to the program. Tonight, the Prime Minister is weighing how to respond to one of the toughest challenges he's faced in his short time in the role, and one of the toughest challenges for the Australia-Indonesia relationship in years. Revelations of Australian attempts to tap the phone of Indonesian President Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono, as well as his wife and 8 senior ministers in close confidants, has rocked the relationship. Already, the President has announced the suspension of cooperation on some intelligence fronts, as well as military cooperation, and the threat is there from Indonesia that there could be further punitive measures. Well, Tony Abbott says he wants to see the relationship a friendly one and put back on track, but how does he do that? He is refusing to apologise and so far refusing to explain exactly what went on. To discuss this and the rest of the week's events in politics, we're joined tonight by the Parliamentary Secretary to the Prime Minister, Josh Frydenberg. Miriam Lyons is the Executive Director of the Centre for Policy Development. Miranda Devine is a columnist with the Daily Telegraph, and Labor MP Matt Thistlethwaite. Welcome to you all.
Nice to be here.
So this letter the Prime Minister has received from President Yudhoyono, Tony Abbott has said he will swiftly respond to. Josh Frydenberg, what do you think he needs to say?
Well, it depends what's in the letter, really. I think the Prime Minister's got the tone right and the policy right on this issue. He has said to the Parliament that we do not comment on specific intelligence matters, and that's been a long-standing tradition of both sides of the political fence for many, many years in Australia. He also said that all countries gather information, and they do that to preserve and protect the interests of their own citizens and to support their allies and their friends. But importantly, David, he said he wouldn't do anything to jeopardise the close relationship with Indonesia, and I believe he believes that, and I believe that under him the relationship will calm down and get back to normal.
But you see, that's the position he's taken for the last couple of days on this, and it's not been satisfactory for the Indonesians. So are you saying he should stick with that position that he articulated on day one, that he shouldn't shift an inch?
I'm very comfortable where the Prime Minister's position is. Obviously, he's going to be privy to that letter that President Yudhoyono has sent him, and he has said not only will he reply swiftly, David, but also courteously and fully as well. So I'm sure that will be made public in due course. But the point is, Australia and Indonesia have too much at stake to let the relationship deteriorate further. It's in both countries' interests to get along well. We have security interests, economic relationships, and of course people to people.
I'm sure that's right, but why shouldn't Australia apologise when US President Barack Obama reportedly did in relation to similar revelations about American attempts to tap the phone of the German Chancellor?
He actually, the reports were he didn't apologise.
Well, some of the reports were that he did.
Well, in terms of the statement that was released, it wasn't about an apology. It was about that President Merkel's or Chancellor Merkel's phone would not be tapped in the future. The point was, made by President Obama there. But the issue here is, if Australia was to apologise, it would be confirming what are allegations, and we do not comment on specific intelligence matters. And it asks the question, well, if you apologise once, what happens in terms of other countries that may sort of seek similar commitments?
Matt Thistlethwaite, I'm confused as to exactly what Labor thinks on this. What do you think Tony Abbott needs to do?
Well, we support a bipartisan approach. In respect of the Snowden leaks and the allegations of information gathering, we're with the government on this. It's a matter of national security. It's not appropriate to be commenting on it. And Bill Shorten said in the Parliament that we would offer the government full support to work to restore the relationship when it comes to normalising relations with Indonesia. So,
but do you think he should apologise or not?
Well, Tony Abbott has access to the expert advice from the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, from officials in both Australia and on the ground in Indonesia.
Is this a question for bureaucrats, or is this a question for the leader?
Well, it's a question of what is the right approach to take, and the experts on the ground, particularly in Indonesia, will be no doubt advising the Prime Minister.
Surely at the end of the day, something like this, this is pretty high stakes. It's the Prime Minister's decision on whether to apologise or not.
It is the Prime Minister's decision, and we will offer support for that decision. That's been relayed to the government in the Parliament. But what we do believe, there's two issues that are putting pressure on the relationship. There's the issue about the Snowden allegations, but there's also the issue of the approach that the government's taken to an important policy area, asylum seekers. We believe that the government needs to change its approach and more emphasise cooperation, as Labor did in government. If we're going
to get to that, and that's, I guess, a separate matter. But what to do about the Indonesian concern over spying, over the tapping of the president's phone and his wife's phone. Clearly they're angered by this, they're hurt by it. Do you think there's a need for some show of contrition from Australia?
There's a need for some sort of action, and there was a similar situation. There's two nations in the world that have been really rocked by the Snowden leaks, and that's been the United States and Australia, and they relate to alleged information gathering. Barack Obama appears to have been able to calm the situation and normalise relations by taking action. There's an approach there that's worked, and we believe that that's something that the Prime Minister should consider. And that's what Bill Shorten relayed in the Parliament today and said that he will get full cooperation and support of the opposition for the government to take that approach.
Miriam, what do you think here? What should the Australian PM do?
I'm not an expert on the sort of dire foreign policy ramifications of using the word sorry, but this is a really serious time for Australia's relationship with Indonesia. The last time that we had the ambassador pulled out was in 2006 when John Howard, I think rightly, agreed to accept 43 West Papuan refugees. Now, that was a situation in which we did the right thing and the relationship suffered from it. I think the time to show backbone is when you're defending an action that's justifiable, and I find it hard to see how spying on the Indonesian president's wife at that particular point in time, is a sort of defendable action in the public interest. And I think we should also take into account the position that the Indonesian president is in domestically at the moment. With the elections coming up next year, we've got candidates who are likely to be far less friendly to Australia, candidates with really worrying human rights records like Prabowo Subianto, former general, who's, potentially a candidate who's actually in the running. And the more that Indonesia, receives this idea that, Australia, is kind of, 1 minute lecturing on human rights, the next minute, spying on the president's wife, suspending the live cattle export, without consulting with them first.
Well, I suppose
expecting them to solve, the refugee flows for us. There's a relationship that's looking a little bit one-sided there at the moment.
Yes.
I think we have to take the context into account.
There is. I mean, it's fanciful to suggest that other countries, including Indonesia, don't spy on each other. It's a given that everybody in
Indonesia spied on us.
They've admitted this in the past
during the whole.
But Miranda, is it different when it's
99.
tapping the phone of the president and the president's wife?
Look, I can understand why SBY is unhappy, but there's just no point carrying on about an apology, because there's no way that the Prime Minister of Australia can apologise, because that would be to admit that the Snowden allegations are correct, and
you don't know what more's to come from Snowden.
Well, exactly. So are you going to then apologise to every country that you've ever spied on? I think I assume that there are going to back-channel conversations going on, and I assume that Tony Abbott will be being very conciliatory behind the scenes, but there's absolutely no way that he's going to do it up front. And I think that, Labor has been speaking with forked tongue on this, because on the one hand you have Bill Shorten saying that we're all Team Australia and as one on this, and on the other hand you have Tanya Plibersek, who's the Foreign Affairs spokesperson, who is echoing the Greens when she says that Tony Abbott's brought this on himself because of his injudicious way of carrying on before the election on boats. And you can't have it both ways.
If Australia and if Tony Abbott had demonstrated more respect for Indonesia's sovereignty in the language that he used around the coalition's refugee policy,
I don't really think
it might not have inflamed resentment in Indonesia.
I think resentment in Indonesia was inflamed by the fact that Labor just cut off the live cattle trade without
say for example, this had become
both Labor
public.
and the coalition's attitude.
If this had become public while Kevin Rudd was still in the job, Indonesia would still be just as furious, wouldn't they?
Absolutely, and that's the context.
So it's not really about. They may have concerns about Tony Abbott's boats policy, but they're angry about the phone tapping of the president,
which dates back to
But that
2009.
on top of the boats policy, on top of it's a pile of things.
There is a lot of hypocrisy here. I mean, you have Lee Rhiannon and the Greens out there saying Australia must go, cap in hand to Indonesia and apologise, when the Greens have policies like their position on West Papua, which would blow up the relationship with Indonesia. And Miranda's absolutely right. Bill Shorten is talking, on one hand about Team Australia and the great bipartisan approach, and then he's differentiating himself from Tony Abbott proposing a different approach, which undermines Australia's united position.
Well, I have to take issue with that
Please
characterisation and Miranda's. What Tanya Plibersek was doing today was pointing out, as I said earlier, there's two pressures on the relationship at the moment. The Snowden allegations, on which there's a bipartisan approach and we support what the government is doing.
But you're not.
But the other issue is the pressure that's been brought by the asylum seeker policy that the coalition's taken. Now, this megaphone diplomacy in the lead up to the election was seen as disrespectful in Indonesia. And then, the whole thing of Julie Bishop holding a meeting with Marty Natalegawa, Marty Natalegawa having to go out and release the minutes of that meeting to prove that what Julie Bishop was saying was a lie. Tony Abbott locking out the Indonesian media.
You're conflating two very different issues.
Just sticking with the spy allegations, though, you are suggesting that the Obama approach is one that Australia should consider. So that is a difference. I mean,
you're having a bob each way,
it
Matt.
is a difference, isn't it?
Well, Bill Shorten didn't direct the Prime Minister to take that approach.
He did.
As I said, no, he didn't.
He did. He got up in Parliament and he said
that is available. No, that is available for the Prime Minister to consider, and if he did, he would have the full support of the opposition.
He was.
So he's suggesting.
He's suggesting it.
He said that that approach worked in the United States, and it's something that should be considered by the government.
Let me ask you this. What do you think that does to the debate in Indonesia about this and how to handle it? If the Labor Party in Australia, the federal opposition, is saying the Obama way is worth considering, surely they are going to demand that from Australia.
The Labor Party's emphasised cooperation, and if we're going to normalise relations with Indonesia, we need to emphasise cooperation. And
but doesn't this
model when we were in
Indonesia?
But the Labor model when we were in government, David, was to emphasise cooperation and work cooperatively. A good example is we identified that there was a problem with Iranians coming to Indonesia and being granted visa on arrival, paying their $25 when they got to Indonesia, being granted a visa, going straight to a port, getting
No question. That was a very good thing to do.
That's the model that will work.
You asked a direct question, which is, you say you want a bipartisan approach, which is in Australia's interest. The Prime Minister's indicated his position, and then you're out there with your leader in Parliament suggesting that he adopt the Merkel model. That is a differentiation in position, and that does undermine Australia's what should be a bipartisan approach.
To be fair, adopting the Merkel model would mean that President would have to call us first.
Well, I want to ask you this as well. Why, if we are such good friends, has there been no phone call between Tony Abbott and President Yudhoyono?
Well, look, there is obviously a lot of heat at the moment in the.
Isn't that the point at which friends should be able to pick up the phone and diffuse some of that?
Well, the President of Indonesia has taken the way of sending a letter, and Tony Abbott has said to the Parliament that he will respond in kind and quickly and courteously.
Sure, but can't Tony Abbott pick up the phone to the President, or is the relationship not that strong?
No, the relationship is very strong. Indeed, they had met only a few weeks before, both in Jakarta and in Bali.
Hit speed dial.
But I mean, the point is that the Indonesian President has sought to write a letter to outline his concerns, and that way Tony Abbott will have the time to respond in kind, and he said he will do so.
At the end of the day, the question about whether he gives, the Prime Minister that is, gives any sort of commitment not to do this anymore. We're not going to listen to your phone and your wife's phone. Is that something he can do, and if not, why not?
Well, as I said before, it'd be to be confirming particular allegations, and it would open up lots of questions from other leaders in other countries. And as they said, they're going into a presidential period in Indonesia, and that's not the way the government's
Miranda, I mean, this is something that President Obama did. He said, look, we're not going to do that anymore.
To you.
Yeah, to you.
Yeah.
Do you think he can? I mean, Yudhoyono has been a great friend of Australia.
Absolutely,
and all of that.
Yeah.
Should Tony Abbott do that?
Look,
offer that?
that on the surface surface seems like it would be the sensible thing to do, to give a sort of a qualified,
You're not saying to the next
narrow,
guy who
no,
takes
just say
over as
we'll
president,
never
but-
tap you or your wife's phone again, and that's not hard to do because he won't be there in another year.
Yeah.
But look, I think it's hard because this is not something that, you know, Tony Abbott wasn't even opposition leader in 2009 when this was going on. We don't know, you know, Kevin Rudd has been AWOL and not available to ask questions of. And so I think that, however, that Tony Abbott will be judged on how he manages it. And at the moment, it looks terrible, but, you know, the experts are saying to us that, you know, the security experts are saying to us that this is something that will manage itself and the heat will go out of it in a few days. And let's see.
Well, let's hope it does.
I'm kind of interested in the wider implications of this. I mean, this does look like a bit of a case of spying that's happening just because we can. You know, like it really is kind of hard to understand, you know, why exactly were we listening to the Indonesian president's wife's phone? It kind of seems like casting the net, you know, just arbitrarily wide. And I actually think that is why the Snowden leaks were so important. You know, we're entering an era of ubiquitous surveillance.
And the other thing we
which
don't know
deserves serious public
is anyone
debate.
authorising that?
Exactly.
Is a minister authorising that, or
Exactly.
is it just the agencies?
And, you know,
Well, they have to do what's
Australia's
right.
intelligence is better scrutinised than in most democratic countries, but that's not really saying very much.
But Miriam, you might
know?
be celebrating the fact that these Snowden leaks have come out, and we said that, you know, the Guardian have said that there's only about 1% of the information that they are in possession of that's in the public realm. So a lot more is to come out. But I can tell you, it's the enemies of Australia, it's the enemies of the Western world who are the ones who are really celebrating here. And the head of MI6 gave parliamentary testimony in the UK to say that it's Al-Qaeda who are the ones who are rubbing their hands with glee, because all this information does make our ability to go out there and protect our national interests, and there are real threats to our national
Behind
interests.
that is the question of how
real
this happens,
threats that
right? So, and you're a great friend of the United States, I know.
Sure.
But
Australia is.
surely something needs to change. You can't have this level of information getting in the hands of someone as junior as Edward Snowden.
Well, these are absolutely unforgivable, damaging leaks, and it's not the first time. If you
That's
look
right.
back with Bradley Manning and the damage there, so this is a real cause for concern, and it does put strains on relationships and does put lives in danger.
So the way that the NSA was conducting its operations doesn't also cause you concern?
Well, the NSA, which is the National Security Agency of the United States, do play a very important role in gathering information right across the world to be used for good purposes.
You don't think they're
namely
going
to
too
prevent
far, though,
security.
tapping leaders' phones?
Well, you know, you're talking about specific allegations, and we're not going to get into the details of that.
I do want to ask one more question, though, on this topic. While the Prime Minister has been very measured in his commentary on this, Mark Textor, who is the Liberal Party's pollster and has been for a long, long time, has been on Twitter expressing some views that well, you'd have to say are derogatory. Most will be aware of what he tweeted yesterday, likening, well, it's a little unclear who, but the understanding is Marty Natalegawa to a Filipino porn star and having the ethics as well. He's apologised today for those tweets. Is that good enough?
Well, he has apologised, and the Prime Minister said in Parliament as well that when he was asked about that they were tacky comments. Look, Mark Textor is a very good man. He's been a great servant of the Liberal Party, and in more than 2 decades of involvement in politics, if he's made one mistake that he's apologised for, I think we can give him the benefit of the doubt. So these were unfortunate comments. He's apologised. We move on, but that takes nothing away from, you know, Mark Textor, who is a very good person, who indeed has served our side of politics very, very well.
You wouldn't have any hesitation taking his advice then, as the Liberal Party does, given that...
I don't have any hesitation in the party relying on Mark Textor both now and into the future.
Miranda, what did you make of this?
Look, it shows what a kind of fetid environment it is at the moment, and it, you know, it was unwise to make that kind of a comment. But you know, it's in this atmosphere, everything's being beaten up, and this is Twitter. You know, it just shows how dangerous Twitter is. And frankly, you know, it's unforgivable to say that about Natalegawa, but you have to also say Natalegawa has not been a friend of Australia. He has been, you know, completely unhelpful from the very beginning with this new government, with, you know, leaking the transcript of his first meeting with Julie Bishop in New York, and just he seems to find the worst complexion possible to put on everything that happens. And I don't, you know, that's something to do with Indonesian domestic politics. And, you know, obviously the government can't go about saying anything negative about him, but you know...
I wouldn't say that he's not a friend of Australia, Miranda. He did his PhD at the ANU.
Maybe that's the problem.
That's right. He did his PhD at the ANU. He's been, you know, the Foreign Minister for more than 4 years. He does understand Australia well. There has been some hiccups and there's been an escalation in the language, which is unfortunate. But, you know, he is the Foreign Minister to SBY, and I think we're all in agreement that SBY has been a very good friend of Australia. And while this is a hot period in the relationship, I'm very confident that cool heads will prevail and the relationship will get back to normal.
But the characterisation of him as the Indonesian Foreign Minister in such derogatory terms from someone who has contracts with the Liberal Party is so close to the Liberal Party and is a confidant of
but he's
the
not a
Prime
member
Minister
of the Parliament, is he?
Really unacceptable.
Well, he's not a member of the Parliament.
No, but at the time that he put that tweet out, he was holding drinks at the Parliament, and many Liberal Party members were attending those drinks.
And you want to hold everybody who's not a member of the Parliament to account, and then
a very major supplier to
he's
the
no
Liberal
office
Party.
bearer. He's no office.
I think the point is,
a shaper of
on another
Liberal
issue at
Party
another
rhetoric
time.
and
There's
political
obviously
strategy.
scope for debate and, you know, robust exchanges on Twitter, but on something as sensitive as this, playing into this Indonesian issue.
It was a mistake.
Played big in Indonesia.
It was a mistake, and those comments are regrettable. And the Prime Minister has said as much in the Parliament, and he is reserved. He is unapologetic. He's apologised unreservedly.
I'm less concerned about one offensive and contemptuous remark than I am about the fact that Crosby Textor are the masterminds of a very divide and rule approach to communicating to the general public, and the coalition is still listening to them. You know, like their whole methodology is based on, you know, like, okay, let's kind of focus group a message about how we can pin everybody's problems on a minority group of people that they hate.
Well,
like, that's a concern.
I think also Twitter is still an evolving beast for a lot of people, and everybody's learning as they go, for better or for worse, with this stuff. We'll take a break, and then we're going to look at some other, well, specific issues linked to this. The asylum seeker policy, Operation Sovereign Borders. Is it progressing the situation? Stay with us.
You know what's great about a typical Aussie Christmas? There isn't one. But no matter where you are or how you celebrate, Merry Christmas, everyone. Oh, Bonbon, white flies and wobbles. A jellycopter. I could use that. There'll be an IGA or super IGA up the street, across the road, or just around the corner, with everything you need to make Christmas easier. So this year, save time, shop local. Scoot down to IGA.
At Shell, we're working hard to broaden the world's energy mix, supplying natural gas for the generation of electricity with around half the CO2 emissions of coal, producing biofuel made from renewable sugarcane with our partner in Brazil, and here in Australia, finding ways to fuel our future. Let's broaden the world's energy mix. Let's go.
And the cat with the bass and drum going around like bum bum bum. I'm so cool and not so groovy when I go bum bum bum. When I go bum bum bum.
This isn't just a classroom, because it's much more than papers, pens, desks and diagrams. This classroom is really in a classroom. This is science, shared. The best teaching the brightest. using brilliant machines to empower local industry to compete on a global scale. Because our most valued resource isn't our technology or even the resource itself, it's our people.
Introducing the Oral-B Black. High performance meets sophisticated design. It's what happens when German engineers have a zero tolerance for plaque. The Oral-B Black, engineered to perform.
Do summer through a straw with Macca's range of new frozen Sprite Splash. Splash in one flavour or mix them all. Then hurry back for a free refill.
When you're doing it yourself, Mitre 10 has the range, advice and prices you're looking for. Oh, nice colour choice.
Kick back in this deluxe inflatable spa, only $5.99, and mighty handy bar fridge, just $1.59.
That's mighty helpful, Mitre 10.
On average, a woman will wake up 30,200 mornings in her life. She'll spend around 7 months walking the dog, 1.5 years without sleep, and 8 months getting out the door. It doesn't always leave time for breakfast. Great new tasting Up and Go V for busy women.
Welcome back to the program. We're talking tonight to the Parliamentary Secretary to the Prime Minister, Josh Frydenberg, Miriam Lyons, the Executive Director of the Centre for Policy Development, Miranda Devine, a columnist with the Daily Telegraph, and Labor MP Matt Thistlethwaite. On asylum seekers specifically, this is one area where Indonesia has now said they're going to suspend cooperation until they get a better explanation from Australia. But we know a couple of concerns Indonesia has about the new government's policies, in particular that promise to buy back boats in Indonesia. Now, this week, the head of Operation Sovereign Borders, Lieutenant General Angus Campbell, admitted that not one boat has been bought back. So does this policy still remain in place, or are you going to shelve it?
It's very much still part of our arsenal of measures, David,
what does that
we will use. Well, it's one of the measures that we will use. I mean, we've just introduced temporary protection visas, which worked successfully during the Howard years. We're getting offshore processing working more effectively. We've got Operation Sovereign Borders under a Lieutenant General, and that's leading to a command and control effort.
So you will buy back boats?
Well, it's part of our policy, and it hasn't been changed from the policy that we took into the election. But there's one really important point to make here, David. That is, in the first 8 weeks of Operation Sovereign Borders, the number of unauthorised boat arrivals is down something like 75%. Now, that's very significant.
Boats, you will buy back boats, and you think it's a good idea?
Well, it's part of our policy. I mean, if those boats are going to be used to come to Australia with unauthorised boat arrivals, and you can do something to stop that, then you should.
So why haven't any been bought?
Well, it's the policy. We're looking for opportunities, obviously, and it's something that, together with the TPVs, together with the offshore processing, together with Operation Sovereign Borders, is producing, this better outcome.
Okay, but you've just said you're looking for opportunities.
Sure.
What does that mean?
Well, it's part of our suite of measures, and Scott Morrison was asked this in the Parliament, and our policy hasn't changed.
No, but specifically on this, I get
sure.
you. But specifically on this, you're looking for opportunities to buy boats.
Well, I'm not running the policy,
No,
right? I mean, and you'd have to ask people who are on the ground. But as far as the government is concerned, that policy still stands.
Is that convincing, Miranda?
Well, in a way it is. I mean, I think it was a beat up during the election to even talk about this boat policy. It's one minute part of an arsenal that they have that they could use if they need to. It's part of the disrupting techniques that, you've got AFP officers on the ground in Indonesia. It's not, it wasn't front and centre, and yet it was made front and centre and then became a big domestic issue in Indonesia. And, I mean, Josh is quite right that the proof of the pudding is in the eating, and we've had a 75% decrease, and the Indonesians are just as unhappy as we are about the 50,000 boat people that have flooded through Indonesia and come to Australia. I mean, it's causes, they've still got 10,000 people who are now locked in Java with nowhere to go if they don't come to Australia. That is really not a good thing for Indonesia. It's very disruptive for them, and it causes all sorts of sort of opportunities for corruption for their police and so on, which is also not a good thing. So the people smugglers have come there with their huge organised crime networks, brought in enormous amounts of money which have caused problems in these small places. And so it's in the Indonesians' interest, and they want just as much as we do, and they've said it for so long, to get, it's now become a cliche, the sugar off the table.
Matt Thistlethwaite, Labor has complained about the secrecy around this Operation Sovereign Borders, and you've also been highlighting the buybacks policy and the towbacks policy, which doesn't appear to have been used either. But on the figures, boats have slowed down.
Well, boats were slowing because of the regional resettlement arrangement. That's the policy that was put in place by the Rudd government, the deal that was signed with Papua New Guinea, such that if you come to Australia, you'll be settled in Papua New Guinea. Now, that element of the suite of policies is still there. So the government hasn't dismantled that element, but it's not a minute part of their policy, the buy back the boats. This was part of the megaphone diplomacy, part of the sloganeering of the election campaign. There were two major elements to Operation Sovereign Borders: towing back boats and buying back the boats. And now we've seen this week, because of the evidence that's been given in estimates, that the policy's not being operational at all. There's been no boats that have been bought. We understand that there was an attempt to tow a boat back to Indonesia that ended in disaster because the boat broke up. That's what was reported in the Daily Telegraph.
We don't know that it was being towed back to Indonesia. It may well have just been attempted to tow it to Christmas Island, because it was just off Christmas Island. But yes, the boat bow came out when they tried to tow it somewhere. So what is different under the new government's policy that's actually working?
Well, the people smugglers take us seriously, because when we were last in government, we did stop the boats. I mean, when John Howard...
So it's the vibe is different.
Well, it's more than a vibe, it's the policies.
Oh, okay. Tell me
okay,
what's
so
changed.
temporary protection
That doesn't apply to anybody.
Genuine offshore processing, Operation Sovereign Borders, coordinated effort, as Miranda referred to.
The regional resettlement arrangement is offshore processing.
Just go through those. Temporary protection visas only apply to those who arrived before August.
But it's a big no. But we've put them in back place now, so it applies going forward.
But they don't apply to anyone coming by boat now.
But we need them as a suite of measures to be a deterrent. And the point is, if you have offshore processing that is working, then people will know that they can't make their way to the mainland or indeed to Christmas Island. And we're starting to get much better coordination in terms of intelligence and the security dialogue with our regional neighbours. And look,
hang on. Are you seriously saying you're getting better coordination with your regional neighbours this week?
Well, this week's is a tough week, but the point is that we've got this 75% reduction, David, and that is the statistic for the first 8 weeks of Operation Sovereign Borders.
You haven't dismantled the regional resettlement arrangement. That was put in place by the Labor government. But we never said that's the crux of why the boats
we never said we never said we would dismantle it. We never said we would dismantle it. You see, we had a policy which had the tow back the boats policy, offshore processing, and temporary protection visas. They were the three headline acts of our last policy when we were last in government. Now, when John Howard left office, there were only 4 people who had come in an unauthorised manner by boat in detention. 4. Right? You've overseen the dismantling of the Howard policy, which resulted in more than 50,000 people coming, more than 800 boats, and an $11.5 billion blowout, and of course the tragedy of more than 1,000 people losing their lives at sea.
Let me ask you, I'm going to take issue with that. You look at the 3 elements of your policy that you just mentioned. Offshore processing, put in place by the Labor government, the regional resettlement arrangement.
After you dismantled.
You've kept that. You've kept that, and it appears to be working.
So your last week of 6 years in government is the one we should be looking at.
Your other approach to buying back boats and turning around botes not being operational.
How do you know that? How do you know that?
Admitted by the chief of the operation in estimates hearings this week. We get more out of him than we do from Scott Morrison in the Parliament.
Let me ask you. It was perhaps a little unfair in saying that it's the vibe, but is there something in that Labor did dismantle it and then put it back in place, offshore processing? At least the coalition have been consistent on this. It does send a message that they're a lot more serious and hardline.
I I don't think consistency on, let's see just how cruel we can be to the refugees who make it here in order to discourage other ones from trying to get here, is anything to be particularly proud of.
That's what both parties do.
Yes, it is. I just think it's always worth taking a bit of a step back here and saying, what do we actually want to do as a country? Australia used to have a reputation on refugees that we could be proud of. We were one of the first signatories to the convention back in 1951.
But in the last few years, the reputation was that we were a magnet and people were dying at sea and all of that.
The issue is, yes, we have been generous. We used to have quite a high humanitarian intake. It was good that the Labor government increased that humanitarian intake. And yes, it's still reasonably high compared to the rest of the world. But this is not a problem that's going to go away. And it's not a problem that's going to go away, especially if a whole bunch of countries around the world look at what Australia is doing, look at one of the richest countries in the world going, no, we're really just not that interested in helping out anymore. And they follow suit. Now, I'm not saying that we should not have...
By pandering to your point of view, Kevin Rudd caused this problem, which is actually all it's done is has drawn people smugglers, these criminals, con artists, who rip off poor people in places like Lebanon and other places in the Middle East, who want to make a better life for themselves. Of course they do.
I'm all in favour of finding ways to stop people smugglers from exploiting refugees.
You can't have it both ways. You can't have it both ways, Miriam.
No, you can. There actually are other options for disrupting the people smuggling business model.
Through a policy such as the regional resettlement arrangement and cooperation with Indonesia. Since we signed the protocol on combating people smuggling with Indonesia in 2010, about 5,000 people have been stopped from getting on boats by the Indonesian.
I wouldn't be talking about your record, Matt. It was pretty atrocious.
And about 120 people have been arrested for people smuggling under that arrangement, signed a cooperative deal with the Indonesian government. Now, you're taking a different approach, and that's the problem here. You're taking an approach that offends the Indonesian government.
David, I want to say this is a sovereignty issue. This is an absolute sovereignty issue. If you want to talk about humanitarian approaches, the people who were getting humanitarian visas under the Labor government were the ones who were coming in an unauthorised manner by boat. By actually stopping the boats, you can get the humanitarian visas to the people who are waiting years and years in a camp. The other point I want to mention is Sri Lanka.
You reduced the number of
Tony Abbott has had a breakthrough with
positions.
Sri Lanka with the presentation of those two custom vessels, supported by Bob Carr. His relationship with Sri Lanka has got to the point where we're now getting much better cooperation.
Let me ask you this, though. What's going to happen to this problem without cooperation from Indonesia?
Look, this is a challenge. This is a real challenge. There's no beating around the bush on that. And I just hope, as I said at the start, David, that cool heads will prevail and that we'll get better cooperation from Indonesia. If you go back to the press conference between Yudhoyono and Tony Abbott in the first week of the Abbott government in Jakarta, Yudhoyono said that people smuggling was terrible for both countries and that both countries were, quote, victims. And it's to Miranda's exact point. The Indonesians do not want thousands of people sitting in Java waiting to get to Australia.
All right, we need to take a break. Then we're going to turn to, a significant moment in Parliament this afternoon. The House repealed the carbon tax. The battle is still to be fought in the Senate, but the House has passed that legislation to scrap the carbon tax. We'll take a look at that.
This is Jennifer Chen. She's a mum who loves buying toddlers' clothes at wootsiecutesy.com. Right about now, you're probably thinking, why would Jennifer be buying a quad bike called the Swamp Pig? ANZ's thinking the same thing. That's because we've got ANZ Falcon Fraud Monitoring. It can sense when a purchase doesn't look right, so you're protected. However, wherever you purchase, by credit or debit card, ANZ Card Security.
Miele invites you to enter the life you've always dreamed of living, where just walking into your kitchen makes you feel good, where your skills skip to a new level without even raising a sweat, where you select from 100 pre-programmed dishes simply by touching a screen, where German engineering and testing to the equivalent of 20 years usage is all the reassurance you need. Miele New Generation Appliances. Designed for life, as it should be lived.
Sydney University tests have proven Osmocote multi-purpose potting mix can make this much difference. Formulated with Osmocote, this potting mix grows healthy, beautiful plants. Grow like a pro with Osmocote professional potting mixes.
We're boosting Queensland's economy by $32 billion over 10 years, but we're not a bank. We're creating jobs for nearly 12,000 people, but we're not an employment agency. We're QGC. Together, we're doing good things for Queensland.
Authorised are Millhouse QGC Brisbane.
Nobody beats our prices for outdoor living.
Pack of 10 mini solar lanterns, only $12.90. 4-burner hooded barbecue, $199. Folding camp chair, just $6.45.
Bunnings Warehouse. Lowest prices are just the beginning.
My personal choice is the Oral-B Power Toothbrush, and it's the toothbrush that most dentists use. With a power brush, it's sort of simulating the same sort of technology that we have as dentists and hygienists. It's like giving you that dentist clean feeling by using the power toothbrush. Clinical studies have shown the effectiveness of the rotating, oscillating technology. I recommend a power toothbrush for every patient because I believe it gives a superior clean.
No wonder Oral-B is the #1 power brush brand Australian dentists use.
Introducing McDonald's new Real Choices Chicken and Spicy Mayo McWrap. With hand-picked tomatoes, spicy mayo, crispy or grilled 100% Australian chicken wrapped in a warm tortilla. For just $5.95, but you better believe it, good.
Think about this. The all-new Trax, Holden's new small SUV, comes with a reverse camera with rear park assist and built-in apps like Pandora, putting over 1 million songs at your fingertips. There's Siri eyes-free technology.
What would you like the email to say?
Plus Bringo navigation to help you find your way. Uncover new Trax from just $24,990 drive away. And for a limited time, you also get a $1,000 gift card. Think Holden.
Welcome back to the program. We're talking tonight to Josh Frydenberg, who is the Parliamentary Secretary to the Prime Minister, Miriam Lyons from the Centre for Policy Development, Miranda Devine, a columnist with the Daily Telegraph, and Labor MP Matt Thistlethwaite. The House of Reps did this afternoon pass the legislation to repeal the carbon tax. The government, of course, has the numbers there comfortably, so no great surprise there. The battle will be in the Senate, though, where Labor and the Greens still have control until July, when the new Senate takes its place. But getting it through the House, I suppose, is a step. Josh Frydenberg, this was centrepiece promise from Tony Abbott in the election campaign. How confident are you about this actually getting through the Senate, though?
I'm confident we'll get through the Senate. Whether it gets through a Labor-Green coalition in the Senate is one matter, and whether it gets through after next July is another. But we did take to the Australian people a commitment to repeal the carbon tax, and they voted emphatically. I mean, the Labor Party got the lowest primary vote since 1903, and it was a referendum on the carbon tax. So now they're denying the fact that they lost the election. They haven't listened to the people. They don't understand the real impact it is having on jobs, on household incomes and families and businesses, and so it's got to go.
Well, the Australian people did vote at the election on an issue, it's hard to think of one that was bigger than the carbon tax. Matt Thistlethwaite, does that mean anything?
Well, a couple of points to make, David. Firstly, Australians understand that climate change is real and that Australia is susceptible, particularly to extreme weather events. So they want action on climate change. We've said we will repeal the carbon tax, but it needs to be replaced with a middle ground option, an emissions trading scheme. We need an emissions trading scheme because under an emissions trading scheme we can cap our emissions. You can guarantee that we pass on a cleaner, safer environment to our kids. That guarantee is not an option under direct action, which is going to be put forward.
Depending on what the cap is, right? Depending on what the cap is, if the cap's, low, then you're not going to reduce emissions by much. If the cap is stronger, then it's going to cost a lot more.
Well, there's a 5% cap at the moment, a commitment to reduce emissions by 5%. That's a bipartisan approach. And under an emissions trading scheme, you can guarantee that because you set the cap such that you reduce emissions by 5%. But what you also do is allow businesses and households to make their own decisions about how they reduce emissions, a market-based mechanism. That's the recommendation of all credible economists on this. It's also the recommendation of 37 parliamentary inquiries into this issue since 1992, including the Sheargold Review, which is the basis of the policy that John Howard took to the 2007 election. So
at the end of the day, though, when it comes to the crunch, if you vote against the repeal of the carbon tax, you're voting to keep it in place.
We're voting to repeal the carbon tax and replace it with an emissions trading scheme.
But the government...
You're not voting for that.
That's the policy that we took to the election.
But if that amendment fails,
You lost the election.
if the amendment fails, then you're voting to keep the carbon tax in place.
No, we're being very clear with the Australian public. And I campaign...
This isn't a tricky question. If the amendment fails, you then have a vote on yes or no, repealing the carbon tax, and you're voting to keep it.
We will move amendments, and we moved the amendments in the House of Representatives to replace it with an emissions trading scheme. We'll move those amendments.
Well, the Speaker didn't let you move those amendments
Well, that's
today.
right, yes.
That's another
we did
matter.
take issue with that.
Yeah.
But we'll move those amendments in the Senate.
And if they
we'll
fail?
continue with a policy of an emissions trading scheme. That was the
if
basis
those
on which
amendments
I was
fail?
elected in my constituency.
You've had every policy under the sun.
No,
you had no carbon tax under a government I lead. Then you had a carbon tax. Then you had a zero price on carbon, which was Anthony Albanese's price. Now you've got an emissions trading scheme again. I mean, you've had every policy under the sun.
Miriam, one thing we still don't know all the detail on is what comes next from the government, and that's direct action. I'm assuming you're a pretty strong supporter of keeping the price on carbon in some form. Do you think Labor's got the right approach here, though?
Look, I'm definitely a supporter of having some kind of a price on carbon. It's one very important part of a mixed approach, and I actually do think that some elements of the Coalition's policy are quite smart. I don't think it looks like they're going to deliver the emissions reductions they've committed to at the budget that they would like, and I'm a bit nervous about the comments that were made just before the election, which was that they would be willing to walk away from that emissions reduction
They're not spending
if the
anymore.
budget blew out, which really means that they're not committed to that emissions reduction. And that itself, the 5% reduction by 2020, nowhere near what we need to solve Australia's share of this massive global problem. And really, the fact that that's a bipartisan target shows us just how unambitious it is. I mean, you've got, obviously Tony Abbott is no longer saying climate change is crap because he knows that a majority of the Australian public think that it's happening, but he's doing everything but by not sending a minister to the talks in Poland. You've got to assume that the fact that Australia was seen as a wrecker in those talks this week was a reflection of coalition policy.
But how far should Australia go? How far should Australia go ahead of the rest of the world?
Well, we're not ahead of the rest of the world. There are plenty of places that are acting ahead of us. There are plenty of places that have higher emissions reductions targets than we do and are well on the way to meeting them. Australia is one of the highest per capita emitters in the world, and we're one of the countries that is most at threat amongst the developed countries. See, this is one of those things. It's, for most countries in the developed world, this is a issue where they have to potentially weigh up their national interest, over the short to medium term against the an ethical decision, because a lot of the countries that are going to be hit hardest by this are in the developed world. They're the places where they're going to have the least capacity to adapt and respond to dramatic change. But Australia is actually going to be on the front line. We already have a very highly variable climate. We're already bushfire prone. All of the best science that we can throw at that shows us that that's going to work. Well. No, not by itself. No. And no one country's action is going to prevent climate change. But this is kind of one of those prisoners' dilemmas game, right? You opt out, and everybody is worse off. You opt out, and other people defect as well, and everybody is worse off. We do have mechanisms for dealing with that. And the funny thing is, other countries are using them. So the US and China are cooperating
to cut pollution than a poor country. And Australia's economic health has been underpinned by cheap coal-fired electricity. And so the idea that you would disadvantage our economy and that is somehow going to cure pollution in the world is just laughable.
It's a really simplistic way of looking at it. I mean, it's the, if we just close our eyes and look after ourselves, the rest of the world will go away and the physics will go away. This is the thing. We are already well on the way to a massive industrial revolution in the way that energy is delivered, right? This is already happening. The vast majority of
wind farms.
No, the vast majority of new investment in new energy capacity between now and 2030, 70% of that investment is going to be in renewable energy, not in fossil fuels.
Miriam,
investment in renewable energy has already overtaken the investment in fossil fuels. China is capping its coal consumption from 2015, and it's doing that partly because of climate change, because yes, it does actually care, partly because it sees itself as a major exporter of renewable energy to the rest of the world in terms of the technology and the panels and the wind turbines and so on, and partly because it's got, London-style pea super killer fogs happening across a whole lot of the north of China. No, that's not carbon dioxide. No, I'm saying it's partly doing it because of climate change and partly because of its own environmental
Miriam, you're missing one key point.
People quite like renewable energy because it's clean.
Josh. Miriam, you're missing one key point. Under the government's own numbers, under the carbon tax, emissions go up. Emissions go up. That is true.
No, it's not. It's not true. I'm not defending the policy as it is. I'm saying that Australia needs to get more ambitious.
So it's very good that you're not defending their policy. You know why? Because the carbon tax is a tax on something that's inelastic. That is electricity demand. The people
All right,
who
so
are
you think the moderation in Australia's electricity demand after the breakneck expensive gold plating by the big electricity companies, the fact that demand reduced, that is elasticity?
The key to efficiencies is through new technology. If you look at companies like Linfox and what they have done, bring down their own emissions by more than 40% through the adoption of new technologies, it's not through a carbon tax. A carbon tax punishes those who are most vulnerable in the community, the household, the families. It hurts business development.
It is not true what Josh said that emissions go up. The way that the world deals with these issues is from a business as usual scenario. In other words, if the world does nothing, emissions will go like that. Same with Australia. If we do nothing, emissions will continue to go like that. The emissions trading scheme will ensure that emissions reduce from a business as usual scenario and eventually turn around and begin to decline. That's the major difference with this.
Let's quickly change topic because we haven't got long left. But speaking of going like that, our national debt, the debt ceiling debate continues. It's only, I think, a couple of weeks, or maybe 3, until the $300 billion limit that we've got at the moment is hit. What happens then, we don't know, unless there's some agreement between the two sides of politics. Now, the government want to take the debt ceiling right up to $500 billion. That's $500 billion. Labor's saying $400 billion will do for now, and you can come back later if you need to. We did hear this week, though, at Senate estimates from the head of Treasury and today the head of the Office of Financial Management making the case that it does need to be higher than $400 billion. Why isn't that good enough?
Well, Martin Parkinson said two things in Senate estimates. Firstly, that the request to increase the debt ceiling to $500 billion didn't come from Treasury. It was a government request. And the second thing is that he did say that. He said that the request was not one that was made by the Treasury. It was a government decision.
Well, Penny Wong asked him, did this come from Joe Hockey?
And he said, I'd rather not say.
Well, he said you shouldn't assume that.
Well, he certainly didn't admit that it came from Treasury. It wasn't a request from Treasury.
He did say it was prudent to lift it to $500 billion.
The second point, that he made the point that debt won't peak above $400 billion this year. So the government.
Do they have to come back every year?
Well, on the latest figures that we released during the pre-election fiscal outlook, had net debt peaking. The gross debt peaking at $370 billion.
And he says it's significantly increased
in 16-17.
Now significantly
April 2016.
But if the government wishes to increase by $100 billion. That ceiling on $400 billion, then they need to justify it. See, the average Australian can't walk into a bank and say to the bank manager, I want you to increase my mortgage without producing any evidence.
Put on the table a mid-year budget update that usually comes out this time of year every year. Here are the figures, or at least just the one page of that budget update that says, here's the new debt projection. Why can't you do that?
Well, because the head of Treasury, Martin Parkinson, said today that a $500 billion lift in the debt ceiling was prudent. He also said, and you didn't mention this...
But he didn't say right now.
No, but he did say that the conditions from the pre-election fiscal outlook had deteriorated from then. Now,
So make that
it's-
public.
Why don't you demonstrate that? Why don't you just
no,
release
but
the
this
figures?
is-
If you release the figures,
this is the
Parliament can make a decision.
This is the testimony to Senate estimates from the Secretary of Treasury. Now,
But my question was, why not just make that set of figures public?
That information will be out there, but the point is
After Parliament rises.
the situation is that the economy has deteriorated. I mean, Joe Hockey's made no secret of the fact it's Labor's debt. We gave you a pristine balance sheet, Matt. We gave you zero. I repeat that, zero government debt.
The Charter of
And now
Budget
you've
Honesty,
given us-
the Charter of Budget Honesty requires the government to act prudently when it comes to debt.
Do we need
a
a
prudent
debt- do we
approach
need
is
a
to
debt
release
ceiling
the
at all?
figures.
No, we don't.
This
We
is
don't.
Labor's invention, by the
we
way.
didn't have one before 2008.
Correct.
I think you're right to call the coalition out on their hypocrisy after having, demonised debt all the way up to the election
But it's not
campaign,
our debt.
and then turning around and not explaining why the debt ceiling needs to be increased. Fine, call them out on hypocrisy, but blocking the increase, I think, is short-sighted and it's irresponsible.
Well, we
We
won't
didn't
block an
have one
increase.
before.
We won't block an
We
increase
didn't.
if the figures are released.
We didn't have it before 2008. We don't need it now. It's not how much
Exactly.
debt
It's a
our country
political
has.
game. It's a
what
political
is
game.
done with
No,
it.
it's not a political game, David, actually. If you look at the United States, the uncertainty that occurred in their economy for weeks and weeks and weeks because of the gridlock in the Congress between Republicans and
I'm
Democrats
saying
could
that
not be repeated
having a
here.
debt ceiling makes it a political
Well, this
game.
is a 2000.
Why do we need a debt
That's
ceiling?
the great
And
irony of
there
it,
are
isn't
other
it? It's a
options as well.
2008 invention by Wayne Swan.
It was not there under the Howard
started.
government.
It started.
Why do we need it?
Well, that's a very good question.
You
but
reckon get rid of it?
Well, I'm not saying that. I'm just saying it started at 75 billion from the Labor Party. They quickly went to 200. Then they went to 250. Then they went to 300, and you didn't lift it before you left office.
The Parliament gets to vote every year on the budget, right? Why do we need this debt ceiling?
Well, good question, but we have it, and Martin Parkinson was being a very professional Treasury guy, and he said that we're blowing out to 430 billion, so the 400 billion is not enough. You know, might be more. I don't understand why Labor is playing silly games here, because, you know, to pretend that now that you're prudent 8 weeks after you've come out of office after creating all this debt, I think you might wait for maybe until Joe Hockey's put out his first budget before you can make an assessment and have some credibility. But at the moment, you have absolutely zero financial credibility.
Miranda, it's not a silly game to ask the government to justify increasing our nation's debt by $100 billion. The average Australian can't walk into their bank and say to their bank
But it's
manager,
not asking you to
increase my
increase the debt
mortgage,
by that much.
increase my mortgage.
It's the debt ceiling.
But I'm not going to provide you with any of the evidence. That's not acceptable to the Australian people. Why should it be acceptable to the Australian Parliament if it's not acceptable
There are some
to the
very
Australian
cold
people?
economic wins internationally, some very cold economic wins in the United States.
We forecast that, and we were open and transparent with the Australian public about that.
And Joe Hockey said that since he's got into office, he's opened every cupboard and he's found more and more spiders.
Yes,
That's
we've
the
heard the
problem.
line a few times, and we no doubt will in the coming weeks as well. We're going to have to wrap it up there. Josh Frydenberg, Miriam Lyons, Miranda Devine, Matt Thistlethwaite, thank you very much for joining us
Thanks
this
for
week.
having us.
Thanks for your company as well. We'll be back same time next week. See you then.